The most overused word to describe 2020 is definitely unprecedented. The thing is, it's true. You could also replace that word with things like uncertain, chaotic, confused. We've had two world-changing events happen back to back, and many entrepreneurs are struggling to manage these complex and yet unknown obstacles. If you're like me and steering a business through all this, I don't know how we can get through it if we don't have clarity on our numbers. I'm so glad that I got NetSuite as a customer. NetSuite by Oracle is the world's #1 cloud-based business system. Finance, HR, inventory, e-commerce, everything you need all in one place, so you save time, money, and headaches. Whether you're doing $1 million or hundreds of millions of dollars in sales, NetSuite gives you visibility and control so you can manage every penny with precision. Join over 20,000 companies who trust NetSuite to go faster with confidence. NetSuite surveyed hundreds of business leaders and put together a playbook on the top strategies that they're using as America reopens for business. You can get that free guide called 7 Actions Businesses Need to Take Right Now and schedule your free product tour at netsuite.com/action. Get your free guide and schedule a free product tour right now at netsuite.com/action. netsuite.com/action. Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Media's New Deal, presented by Oxford Road. American companies have found themselves in the center of two crises this year. First, COVID-19, and now grappling with how to constructively address racism in America following the murder of George Floyd. Media's New Deal is a new series designed to help you adapt your advertising in a very complex, difficult, and dynamic environment so that you can successfully market your business while also doing some good in the world. I'm your host, Dan Granger, founder and CEO of Oxford Road. Welcome to Media's New Deal. Today's guest is Nick Quah. Nick is effectively the Walter Cronkite of podcast. You probably know him as the publisher of the thought-leading, insightful, and thorough podcast industry newsletter, Hot Pod, which also appears as a regular weekly column on Harvard University's Nieman Lab. Very nice. In addition, Nick produces and hosts the Hot Pod Summit, a twice-yearly conference that brings together the top players in the podcast industry, and he's a contributing writer to New York Magazine's Vulture. And when there's time left to spare, he also has his own podcast that has just launched, Servant of the Pod, through LAS Studios to explore the culture and business of podcasting. Before that, Nick worked at Business Insider, BuzzFeed, and Panoply. He was born in Malaysia and now lives in Boise, Idaho. Nick, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Hell yeah. A couple of things. Servant of Pod, not servant of the pod. No, definite article is important, but not in this situation.
Understood. Thank you. What did I miss anything else in that?
I have a cat. I like long walks on the beach, and thought leading is a really weird word for me. But I guess I'll have to grow into it at some point.
Yeah, you got to own it, man. You're doing the work.
Boy.
So what's life like in Boise right now? I have no idea where Boise is in terms of all the kind of cultural upheaval that we're seeing and what life is like there. How is that culture right now?
Well, Boise is it's a majority, a sharply majority white city in a sharply majority white state. There was a sort of a big vigil a couple of weeks ago. And so that was probably the community's biggest expression of solidarity with what we've been seeing across the country. But by and large, it's been relatively quiet. There's been some young kids hanging out in front of the state capitol with signs and protests. But for the most part, it's a function of demographics. There's spiritual solidarity, but as a percentage of the city, I think that the vigil is the one big expression there. I think what's also been interesting is there's been smaller towns across the state, across the country that have been also protesting. That's been a fascinating thing to see.
Sure. And in parallel with that, we're still dealing with the health crisis to varying extents. Are you all able to go out and do life in a semi-normal fashion with face masks, or how are you guys doing on reopening?
It's complicated largely because there is this sense, I think, Idaho is an index of the rest of the country in many ways. That's not the major cities that have aggressively tackled the pandemic. In the sense that there is this sort of strange willful ignorance about the severity of what's going on. And so there's this push to reopen the state. And at the same time, we're seeing trends that's not great for the state. And, I think the adage now is that we're not going to see a second wave because the first wave hasn't ended. And there is a feeling to some extent that we've normalized this in a way that's quite bad. So I'm, staying bunkered in my little bunker here.
Yeah.
And, I'm taking it seriously, even if the world makes me think I'm crazy.
Yeah, understood. Well, and for what it's worth, I think the world's crazy. So I think you're probably on a good track. So listen, this has been a hard couple of weeks, I think, for everyone. And as we look at the podcast industry, what do you think that the industry's role is? We started with one crisis, and I feel like we are quickly transitioning into another. And I think we all believe that this is something that requires a lot of time and attention for the foreseeable future. We've got work to do, and the nation is getting increasingly divided along political lines, in my view. And so, as there's so much upheaval right now, as there's so much unrest and so many people uncertain about how they should live, how they should act, how they should talk, and wanting to do the right thing, but not knowing what to do. What is the podcast industry's role in all of this?
Well, first and foremost is to, clean the house, right? Just to clarify, I think my perspective on this is that this is not like a new problem. Like we're talking about, race inequities and structural racism that's persisted not just in business and industry across America, but just in the very fabric of its laws, very fabric of its services provided, very fabric of its politics. So, we're looking at a situation where we see an explosion of these kinds of protests pop up every, almost as if it's a cycle, depending on a certain mix of factors, with every new sort of media forefronting of a police killing of an unarmed Black man or a police killing of a Black person. And so this is a situation where we have this sort of perfect storm in which there's a ton of people out of jobs. There's a ton of people already hurting. And even though they may not be Black, maybe they're white, they are being made to see the nature of how the fabric society has been failing themselves and the people around them, and specifically people who have been historically disenfranchised. So to come back to your original question, two things. One, you're right. One is podcasting fundamentally is sort of an information distribution, media distribution ecosystem. So that's the role that it plays, right? How is it facilitating information? Can it get voices out there that otherwise, would not have been heard? And can those voices be able to be given the same kind of opportunities to build sustainable businesses at the same sort of hit rate, at the same opportunity level as any other historically advantaged demographic? But a second layer here is any place that has built organization or any community has built a system of representation also needs to take very seriously the nature of the inequities within their own home. So, things like pay inequity, things like microaggressions and toxic workplaces is really important for as much as a podcast team or a podcaster. We want to speak about the issue to make sure that they're not replicating the sins in their own home as well.
Understood. And I want to affirm what you said earlier. I don't believe this is a new issue, but the new part about it to me seems that it was probably easier for many of us to ignore or just not give appropriate attention and energy to. But I think the fact that we saw this happen on video, we're all now witnesses. And I think that that's had a profound effect in an awareness level that is triggering all this action. Would you agree with that?
To make you slightly more uncomfortable here, the we in your statement presupposes like a white default here. You can't see it, and maybe it's not clear, but I'm Asian, and we have a different sort of life experience compared to white people, but also Black people, and it's something that I see, and it's something that I'm very intimately familiar with being a fabric of everyday American life. And so I think what we're seeing instead is the default, powerful demographic seeing this and waking up to it. And so it's a moment that, and again, I think combined with the fact that we're all stressed out, with the pandemic and the economic pains of the pandemic, it is a breaking point where you kind of go, you can't really compartmentalize this right now. One problem, it's not just the one problem, it's all problems interrelated. We need to take them seriously.
Agreed. I think that's good insight. And so let me ask you a question. You were also talking about, podcasts and the opportunity that it presents for unheard voices to be heard, which is interesting. I mean, one of the reasons I think this renaissance happened in audio via podcast is that a lot of the barriers to entry came down and created a more level playing field for all kinds of voices that may not have had a way to, get distribution because they weren't going to, it wasn't going to be top 20 material on a local radio station, right? But my question for you on this is, do you think it is a level playing field in podcast?
No, I mean, it depends on what you mean by a level playing field, right? Like, so the theory or the structural theory that I've always seen this is when it comes to something like broadcast radio or broadcast anything like anything linear, we're talking about a very limited access to the means of production and distribution. So if you want to get on TV, if you want to get on a radio, you need significant resources
Yeah.
to, not just make the show, but also reach the people. And so more often than not, that means accessing gatekeepers or having gatekeepers bring you into the fold. And that almost always defaults to people who like historically have an advantage. And so in theory, podcasting, much like blogging and the rest of the internet, allows for the opportunity for different voices and people to create shows, publish, and potentially access audiences. There is a level in which like the access is theoretically possible more so than getting on a public access television channel, for example. However, the problem with, the sort of inequality with podcasting is less about production and creation, and it's more about scale, right? Or sustainability, or access, or really accessing in terms of reach to people that they want to access. So it's a different equation, and it's a different kind of inequity. Maybe naturally in the setting, a person with a pre-existing brand name like celebrities would naturally have a better reach. And people who have pre-existing profiles, maybe they write for a website or something, they have access to people that they already have. But for people who otherwise do not have platforms, for them to get the 0 to 1, it's still difficult and requires additional resources and support. So it's a very different kind of problem, but I feel similar dynamics can come into play, even though it's slightly less, I would argue, challenging than the traditional linear broadcast model.
So I'm gonna say that back to you and see if we're on the same page.
Yeah.
The barrier to entry is still low, so you can theoretically have content from a very diverse set of voices that is available to people now, which is that's progress, that's a win. The challenge is that as you see millions of podcasts in the ecosystem, it's very easy to get drowned out, and the advantage goes to those who can promote and really scale and turn it into a viable business, which ends up just kind of funneling the kind of power source back to the traditional players. Is that a fair reflection of what you're saying?
That's a fair reflection. Another way to flip it is that like the problem used to be scarcity, right? Like there was a scarce access to means to access audiences. Now the problem is saturation. And what does it mean to operate effectively within a naturally saturated environment? But I would also argue that podcasting and the internet more broadly is a little better off because it allows for the creation of smaller businesses at a higher rate than like a linear broadcast structure, right? You can really validate the 1,000 true fans theory and build a sustainable business off that in podcasting and internet and blogging. But you can't really do that with television. You can't really do that with radio necessarily, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, yeah, there's a way in which it's different, but there's a way in which we are still working with the same problems.
Very good. Now, Nick, you write a newsletter about the podcast industry. I'm a white guy in LA who runs an ad agency, and I'm doing a podcast for businesses and marketers and people in media to figure out how to navigate this environment. But, I think about when actors or actresses give their political opinions and everybody says, stop it. We don't want to hear your voice on this subject. Right. And I think, at least for me, I think anytime you start to take a step towards such complex issues, There's maybe an impostor syndrome that kicks in for me personally, where I go, I don't have any business talking about this. And yet I think what we're all starting to feel collectively is that we are expected to have a voice. It's not an expectation that you'll stay on the sidelines. There's an expectation that you're going to weigh in, which I think is a new dynamic since I've been in the workplace. What do you see as your role as a journalist in all this, when your primary subject is podcast, but things come up that are as complex and important as race in America?
So my responsibility first and foremost is to do the job that I've always been doing with my work through the newsletter, which is to tie the pieces together.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a sort of a philosophical touch point for my work in the newsletter that nothing is separate, like everything's sort of related, you know.
Mm-hmm.
It would be a mistake to talk about podcasting without grokking economic realities, without grokking political realities. And what happens in one part of the ecosystem affects every other part in direct and indirect ways. So the hope is to foreground things that's most pertinent and relevant and interesting from a narrative perspective for the community to understand themselves within the larger sort of context of the world around them. So this might be too wonky, but like I really do believe in this theory of like newspapers, news organizations, media organizations, one of their conceptual contributions is to create a sense of an imagined community that it ties a world together. And so that's sort of primarily my job, but I'm also a person. And I do not, you know, it's funny that I think in the intro that you used for me, you brought up Walter Cronkite. And I think it's like such a, you know, it's a nod to an older time of media and journalism in which it's a faceless voice, it's a voice of God kind of thing. And Cronkite specifically had that moment where he started, I believe he like cried on air during footage of a war or something. And that was sort of a peek through of his humanity and the beginning of this sort of, you know, journalism isn't a totemic or it isn't like a church, right? It's not a big institution that's faceless. It's a person. So I feel like my responsibility is to be a person and be transparent in how I'm trying to tie this community together.
Understood. Now, you decided not to send out a newsletter last week as a gesture of solidarity with the people that were protesting and the people that were in pain. Can you talk a little bit more about that decision?
You know, so just to timestamp this, we're talking at June 12th. I think you're referring to June 3rd. That just, you know, make sure everybody's oriented.
Well, and it gets worse. This isn't going out until next week. So
oh yeah, and then
clarifying.
For all you listeners in the future, this was 2 weeks ago, probably. I'm gonna hesitate a little bit to give a full-fledged thought to what my theory is of how proper solidarity should be. But for me, the decision came from my interpretation that what was important in that moment of the protest movement and the protest sort of surge is to vacate the public square and let the streets take over, right? It's a situation in which like I don't want to contribute to anybody's distraction away from this moment. And you know, it's also a way for me to for whatever influence or currency that I have to signal that this is important and this is all consuming, and it would be disrespectful to pretend otherwise. And I do not want to go on as business as usual because I personally do not feel like business is as usual. To be perfectly frank, like I could not function from a work perspective for about a week and a half throughout the protests because, you know, it's just a very painful time, and it is necessarily painful because, you know, people die, you know, like, and it's one of those things where you gotta be transparent about it. If I put on a brave face and try to put out another newsletter about some platform making some decision, it just didn't sit right with me as a person. So that was part of the decision as well. It's much about solidarity as it is about a personal decision.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. It was a very decent gesture. Now, as you think about podcast, you know, I've always looked at journalism as, you know, it could be a number of different things. It can be a way to entertain. It can be a way to distract. It can be a way to reinforce thinking. It can be a way to stretch thinking. But I think, in my view, and you may not agree with this, but the highest use of these platforms is to affect change that benefits society. And I'm interested to know if you believe that. And either way, do you see any examples either in the recent past or, just looking back at the history of podcasts where podcast as a vehicle has been used to affect change in culture and society?
What would you say is an example of change affected?
Oh, you're turning it back on me. Okay, let me think on my feet here. It could be as simple as money raised toward a cause. I mean, I'll just use our podcast as an example. We're, one of the things we do with part of our time on this show is we try to raise money for Children's Hospital to get volunteers who can go in and hold babies who have nobody that is bedside to take care of them and to give them that comfort and love. When we get donations from people that are listening, that changes society, that changes culture. Those are people that need help and don't have a voice. And we're able to use, in a very, very small way, this very small platform that we have to affect change. So that's one small example. But I'm sure I could find others.
No. So I'm just sort of thinking how I want to approach
Yeah.
this answer.
Yeah,
So I
it's
think
it's a tough one, and
no,
when you
it's also
flipped it, I realized how how difficult it is to be asked. So
yeah, it's also
appreciate that.
I'm also trying to figure out like how much of like my personal politics we whip out here. Okay, so I think I'm gonna approach this on three different levels. One is, of course, one of the things that draws me to media specifically, and media in general, but podcasting in specific, is because I do believe in the formative role of media systems that media systems play in the shaping of societies and life, right? It is when you consider states that actively censor the media, actively burn libraries, right, which is a
Yeah.
form of media, you are doing something to the very fabric of the way the society functions and the way that they think about themselves. So of course, like I do see podcasting as an extension of the media ecosystem in the sense that it can affect change. So, but the question is sort of like how does that work, right? To break it out to two different levels, I think the example that you use is one that's very sort of direct, right? So kind of a direct response version of change incurring.
Such is my nature.
You represent direct response brand, so maybe it's the feeling. There is the more baseline level is that it's in a position to build communities, extend opinions, shape opinions, introduce opinions to the public square, introduce policy ideas, philosophies, all these things. Like we need a place to access new ideas. We need a place to affirm ideas. We need a place to challenge ideas. All these things are important components of the media ecosystem and for podcasting in specific. And one could argue that podcasting has effectively risen up to that level, that it's been able to do that to some extent. A couple of interesting examples here. Crooked Media obviously is a very overt example of a media company that's very aggressively trying to form a political community, even perhaps a political voting bloc, while at the same time sharpening certain policy ideas. Of course, there are tons of critiques that you can make about Crooked Media as a political idea machine, because it's very much centrist-ish. Podcasting also has a very sharp progressive left, sharp radical left. Chapo Trap House is one component of it. So we're looking at a spread of a couple different kinds of communities playing out in podcasting that's been able to coalesce different kinds of sort of idea spheres here. This is also true of the right, I should say. If you look at the Apple Podcast charts right now, you can see the bubbling up of quite a decent number of conservative and right-wing podcasts, to the extent that you can argue a diversity of thought of that nature is important. As a person who feels the negative effects of conservative policies, I would go like, wow, if I could have my way, I would control that speech. But of course, that's not the baseline fundamentals that we have here, which is everybody should have a fair shot at speech. Okay, put that one aside, one bucket. The other thing here is this sort of the more active role, like has podcasting resulted in any significant physical impact in the world? There's been some interesting examples of this. I would argue that Dan Taberski and Henry Milovsky's Running from Cops documentary that came out last year shaped in some way or provided the ecosystem with the material for people to educate themselves about why really popular shows like Cops and Live PD are aggressively and actively bad for society. So even something like that. But my third layer here in general is just this notion of change as charity. I kind of feel like there's a way in which charity can be sort of weaponized to dissociate the personal responsibility of an organization, a listener, from actually incurring change where they can, which is in their own homes, their own dinner tables, their own organizations. And so it's kind of like a whitewashing thing, you know, billionaires using philanthropy to whitewash their sins. That's kind of the maximal model of this. And so I'm throwing a bunch at you. It's like
Yeah. No, it's good.
It's clearly a signal that I think it's a really complex question, really complex topic, and that there are multiple conflicting points about it, and one should not shirk away from the complexities and the nuances of this question.
Well, and that's why we're talking about it, right? Is these are unusual times that we can't hide from issues that we may have been able to sidestep in the past, and I think grappling with them is the point. So definitely aligned with you on that. So let me ask you a question. What are your concerns for the podcast ecosystem right now? What troubles you?
Many things trouble me. One would say that it is my job to find the things to be troubled about.
Mm-hmm.
I think that first and foremost, there's this anxiety around Spotify in specific, and just like capitalism in general. The whole theory that what Spotify is trying to do with its $500 million plus now acquisitions and deal making in the podcast space will lead to what is ultimately a centralization of power and opportunity in the podcast space. This would be a characterization that Spotify would dispute and argue against. And at this point, we aren't seeing the full picture yet. So, I personally won't come down one way or another until we'll see the full extent of the plan. But the combination of all that money spent, the combination of Spotify's ambition, and the combination of what they're very clearly working on in terms of the ad tech side, would lead one to sort of believe that there's a play here that this might end up looking like a YouTube for podcasts. Again, this would be an assertion I think that Spotify would argue against, but that is the number one thing that is on most people's minds right now, I think, when you kind of like walk around a podcast community and talk to people. Go ahead.
Can you dumb that down for me a little bit in terms of like, or just take a step forward with it? What is the impact or potential impact? Like paint a doomsday picture for me of what that could mean that is a negative outcome.
Yeah, the doomsday picture is YouTube, right? To one extent, YouTube is an effective machine for advertisers, but to another extent, YouTube is a very ineffective machine for people who are creators who are not competing to be the next. Name me like a PewDiePie or whatever, or whatever, one of the Pauls, whichever is more famous. I don't care. That is the concern, because I think the way that I would phrase this is an accessible media ecosystem is one where all sorts of businesses can equally thrive. A system in which all the incentives disproportionately disproportionately serve the biggest interests is an ecosystem that we do not want for podcasting. I want my 1,000 downloads a month podcasters to thrive in their own capacity to the same extent as anybody who wants to build the next $1 billion company using this as a platform for that. Of course, this could also be, utopian thinking. Is there a universe in which both things are possible? I don't know. I don't think so, but...
Have you ever seen it?
No, largely. I mean, I also kind of feel like...
I wonder if you're Don Quixote on this one.
Yeah, I'm probably Don Quixote. I am probably quixotic on this, but I think where my head has coagulated around over the past year and a half is that the focus should be building out a middle class, much like in society, right? Like, can we build a middle class set of companies? What are the conditions and policies to get us to that place, so that more people can make more money and have more opportunities to make more stuff? When you have one that's hyper privileging the top, you have fewer people making more money, making less things. And that's just bad.
So very interesting perspective. Tell me, put yourself in the shoes of the million hosts, or however many we think are active. What do you think they are concerned about right now? Is it the same thing, or are they not even conscious of that and worried about something else? What is talent thinking about right now that's keeping them up at night?
So talent from as in an everyday talent, or talent as in like people who are working very high levels in podcasting? Because I think they're both of them are thinking about similar but different things.
Let's put a definition of just saying people whose full-time focus is creating podcast content.
Right. The fundamental basic question is always the same. Can I keep doing this in a sustainable way, or a way that, can I self-actualize? Can I build a business on my own terms here? And to what extent am I given the equal opportunity to do so with other kinds of businesses? And of course, there's some realities you have to check on that. Like people with more money coming in obviously has more capacity to make more stuff and access more marketing resources.
Mm-hmm.
But the fundamental question is, people want to know, will they have less of an opportunity to run their businesses tomorrow compared to today, compared to yesterday? And the concern increasingly as a player like Spotify, or even just like the whole trend that we've seen of celebrities coming in, is people feeling like, am I going to be gentrified out of this system, right? Am I going to be pushed out by people who have developed their power bases elsewhere? And that is, I think, the number one anxiety that I hear. And you can unfold from that many other sort of specific strands of that, like advertising. Is it only going to go towards companies that make podcasts that average $1 million downloads? Will advertisers ever look at my 30,000 download a month podcast? What are the options do I have for that? Another strand would be direct revenue. How many people are kind of really pushing hard into direct revenue now? So Patreon, Memberful, that kind of stuff. But there's anxieties around, as everybody picks up Patreon solutions, will we be stressing out listeners too much by making them, by asking them to directly support too many shows? What happens to their wallets? That kind of thing.
Yeah. And let me ask you about if we think about that person who is trying to support themselves as a podcaster as a full-time job, is that getting easier or harder to do?
I think I go back and forth on this question all the time, because there is an argument from people who've been here for a long time, since 2010s or whatever, that it's gotten harder simply because there are more competitive players right now, as opposed to just a bunch of folks sitting around. Not that there's anything wrong with like a bunch of folks sitting around at microphones and making a podcast, right? Like that's a different kind of thing. But if you were say a 70,000 download per episode average podcast, it's harder for them to get from 70 to 100 to 150 now, it feels like, because listeners as a whole they have a ton of things to choose from now, and they're not the only player in the space. So from their perspective, I think it's gotten progressively difficult. I've also heard perspectives, and I think I agree with this to some extent, that it's easier to tap into money now. It's easier to get from 0 to 1 or 5 to 10 if you were playing your cards in a certain way, right? So I feel like
that takes away autonomy, doesn't it?
To some extent, yeah. I feel like I'm empathetic to all sides here, but I keep going back to the concept of, are there more people being able to make podcasts and make a living out of making podcasts? Is there more money going to their pockets? And are there more podcasts being made at a sustainable rate? And I think we're largely in a better trajectory now than we were 4 or 5 years ago. But I am open to the argument that I'm wrong on that.
I'll take the counter position on that and say what I observe is that it was more of a meritocracy at the beginning, where the early adopters, the Mark Marons, could set up shop in their garage, and it was like, hey, they're here and it's unique and there's less competition. But over time, I think we're making shows faster than we're making audience members. And so that has to dilute, right? And so, and people only have so many hours in a day. So if you start the next podcast, and every conglomerate now has a podcast arm or is in the process of developing one, now for them to get a user or a listener, they have to knock somebody else out of somebody who's already a listener in the ecosystem. They have to trade, they have to steal that listener from another show. And so in my view, it is getting harder. Unless you have resources behind you to promote and to kind of get an edge in people being even aware that you have that.
Yeah, I'll say a couple more priors here. I also think that I do, in my latent, like, pro-capitalism stances, maybe, like, more competition means that there is some push for the quality bar to go up. So no longer can it just be a simply edited show if you want it to be the next whatever, right? At the same time, the other part that I have is that just because you made something doesn't mean that it,
That it's
doesn't mean
good.
it doesn't mean that it's good, but also doesn't mean that you should be entitled to an audience, right? I think that's a really kind of tough concept for some people to grok, but like, just because you made something doesn't mean that, people should be listening to you. You got to go work for that to some extent. The question is there equal opportunity in the terms of the work putting in? And I think that's a very challenging thing to measure up on any objective level, but it is a question worth asking, and it's a question worth pushing for better outcomes. Like, if we end up 5 years from now seeing that all the major winners economically of the podcast space all tend to be a certain kind of view, all tend to be a certain kind of voice, all tend to be a certain kind of demographic, all tend to be a certain kind of show, we have effectively failed the fundamental promise of what podcasting offered in the first place.
So let's get back into the hard stuff. Okay, so I came out of AM radio. That was my primary focus for 10 years before launching my agency. And AM radio was dominated by, and still is dominated by, conservative voices. You had talk radio personalities, and then on the other side you had NPR. But that was really it. The Air America experiment, which we were trying to advance that as well. It didn't pick up steam. What do you see in the podcast ecosystem? Is there a disparity one way or the other, with more audience or more content moving toward one side of the political spectrum or another?
I mean, it's a good question. I feel if you asked me this 3 years ago, I would almost like undoubtedly say yes, right? Like, I feel like right after the 2016 elections, if you just sort of look up and down the charts, you sort of look up and down, what podcast listeners say that they're actively listening to, there was definitely a left to progressive lean when it comes to overtly political shows. So this is bracketing out, journalism outfits and news outfits.
Sure.
So specifically, we're talking things like Crooked Media, but also, let us not forget that Mark Maron is an Air America alum.
I used to try to sell a show. It was hard to get $25 a spot when he was on radio. I mean, seriously, it was amazing to watch. Podcast made him a king when he could not make it in radio. It was really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, and I think to some extent it's like it is the function of the demographic consuming the medium, right? Historically, prior to, I want to say, the past 2 years, the conventional argument is podcast consumers tend to be more affluent, podcast consumers tend to be younger, podcast consumers wouldn't almost necessarily have to be iPhone, consumers.
Right.
So one would argue that for the most part, the majorities of that demographic tend to lean left, tend to lean progressive, and therefore, it's a matching of the product and the people. I am not sufficiently well versed in the nature of AM radio. I have a conventional, casual understanding of why conservative talk radio, for a number of reasons, is the predominant presence in broadcast radio, I would argue. But it does feel like there's a sort of mixing, of this sort of pairing of medium and audience. I think to some extent that podcasting has shifted away a little bit from that, as a type of consumers of podcasting begin to diversify as well. And we're not just talking about diversification in terms of race, right? We're also talking about diversification in terms of age, political ideology, and to some extent, I suspect that that's what we're seeing a little bit with a couple of the shows bubbling up the Apple Podcast charts. One caveat is that the charts can be very easily gamed, and so maybe that's also what we're looking at. But they're, drawing from the fact that podcasting is notoriously hard to track from a granular level, I kind of feel like we're seeing a little bit of a drift away from a collective left and more towards some sort of collective middle here. Yeah, and also you got to account for the fact that like you got a couple of pariahs that were pushed off from mainstream outlets. So Bill O'Reilly is no longer on TV, but he has a podcast, and from what I've heard, it does drive some considerable listenership. We're also seeing traditional radio companies that have historically privileged shows that are slightly right-leaning participate more heavily in podcasting. That also diversifies both the supply and the demand. So I think we're seeing some sort of a regression to the mean as podcasting grows bigger and quote unquote more mainstream.
What I am seeing increasingly happen, and within the last few weeks, is there is a lot of pressure on brands to disassociate with programs that lean right, where labels like racist are not being ascribed to the system that we all live in. It's not about does America have racism in its DNAs? That's a broader question. But when you're talking about an individual, when you slap a label on an individual who does not see themselves that ways, and we are making a judgment that they are different than the others because, and therefore they should be shunned by the market, you get into very dangerous territory. But we're there. We are absolutely there. And I wonder, do you think that it is helpful for brands to be making business decisions based on the accusations that are made by third-party groups?
Yes, I wait. What was the frame of the question again? Do I think it's a good thing, or
is it helpful? Is it helpful?
Is it helpful for brands to be making decisions based on pressures from third-party groups?
Yeah, correct. So in this particular instance, I don't mean that theoretically. I mean very specifically. We've had, and it's not just conservative leaning podcasts. We're seeing podcasts that are general interest shows where somebody did something that was seen as insensitive in the past. And then all of a sudden there are people on social media saying, well, look at this event that occurred, or thing that they said, or thing that they wore that was racially insensitive or insensitive to one group or another. And therefore, if you are supporting them, you are supporting hatred, you are supporting racism. You should no longer be associated with these programs. And it's not usually a customer driven thing. This is not usually driven by people that bought the product and said, hey, as a customer, I have a problem with you doing this. This is usually a third party that has a point of view and an agenda to advance, and they're putting advertisers in the crossfire to silence the voices that are competing with those interests. And so, I'm probably showing my cards. I don't think that's constructive. I don't think that's helpful. And I wonder how you feel.
I think I would disagree by saying that I do think to some extent it's constructive, because what you're essentially saying, I think that what's happening there is a situation in which we're seeing processes that are greater than capitalism, right? We're seeing processes that's greater than the buying, selling of ads, and the facilitation of capital and product. We're seeing active campaigns to try to shape culture. And part of that means a maximalist approach to building up disincentives for having ever participated in any form of racist expression. Maybe you could go on another rabbit hole, like to what extent do you allow an individual to change and grow from what they've done 5-10 years ago. But the fact of the matter is that right now we're seeing a swell of cultural push to increase the cost of doing something like that. And so I don't think that you can necessarily separate any other process from this. If one of these ways is to pressure brands to be more thoughtful about who they're partnering with, to pressure brands to be more thoughtful about how they're constructing their supply chains, how they're handling their workers, go for it. Because at the end of the day, this is all in the interest of building a better world. And even though some parts of the society might disagree, it is a process that should be able to play out. And whether I feel it's constructive or not, whether you feel it's constructive or not, is a little bit relevant to the question, because it's where we are, and it's kind of independent to our sort of personal moral judgment of it at this point in time.
Yeah, well, and listen, that may not be a decision you have to get pulled into often, but certainly the brands that we're working with are getting pulled into this whether or not they want to every day. And where I totally agree with what you just said is, if it's a force that causes them to be thoughtful and judicious about where they're aligning their brand, I think that's a positive thing. The challenge that I see is that there is nothing thoughtful. There is no thoughtful process being applied to it. It's a soundbite followed by an accusation, followed by a label, followed by a if you don't do this, then you are that. And people are caving to that pressure, which is not driven by, I don't believe, a noble principle, or you would have done that due diligence on the front end and said, we take a political stance and we don't want to be in affiliation with anybody that takes an opposite political stance. Now, there's another layer of it, which is that, is it really helpful to advance your ideology if you only preach to the choir? Or is it possible that the values that a brand holds will be more effective if they can be shared to people who hold different belief systems? Do you actually advance the things that you're trying to protect by only associating with those that already believe that? Or is it actually more effective for those values to bring them? Because it's, the way that I look at it is, the advertiser is bringing their message to the audience. They're not, the show host is not bringing their values to the advertiser. The advertiser's values are not changing. It's their values that are being expressed because it is their words that are being said to the audience. And so I see it as very destructive. And I liken it to what we saw with the Red Scare, where you had a blacklist that said, hey, there are these voices that we disagree with, and if you do business with them, you will suffer consequences for that, because these are negative voices that need to be silenced, and there was no consideration given.
That's a little different because the Red Scare is an expression of a pre-existing power structure applied to people with less power. What we're seeing is the other way around, right? Like, we're pressure from people, from masses that historically as individuals do not have as much power, pressuring entities that have more power than them. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, I think the Red Scare thing, that's not a comparison you want to make.
Well, maybe it's not, but I'm not compelled yet. I want to hear more about
it. No, I hear. I mean, I understand if you're not compelled yet. I think the other argument here is that, yes, this is a messy, imprecise, chaotic process, but it's not like there was a formal process that everybody could trust in the first place. What we're seeing here is an expression of the fact that there is no real other way to do this. Like, there is no other way to pressure certain multinational billion-dollar companies to stop supporting, on the one hand, like, stop engaging in supply chain practices that are actively harmful to workers. That's one version of this, of how this has manifested. And there has been no other traditional recourse to pressure billion-dollar brands from supporting or for being politically neutral, when political neutrality is something that is kind of a fantasy, right? Like, yeah, you build a C-suite and maybe there's some ideological diversity on the board, but the fact of the matter is it participates in a structure that can harm certain demographics of others. So I kind of feel like what we're seeing is that we're seeing an expression of people en masse feeling that they have no other recourse, right? Because the institutions that be have not adequately allowed or provide solutions and pathways for them to find recourse. We're also seeing a version of this with what's been happening with media salaries and pay inequities in media companies, from Condé Nast to, I guess Washington Post to some extent, for just allowing, like, how do you treat journalists of color? I think this is all an expression of, if you trusted the institutions, the organizations to solve this problem politely, you'll never see these problems solved. And that's why we're seeing what we're seeing.
I guess so when you talk about multinationals billion-dollar companies. I look at the podcast industry. This industry was built by D2C brands, in my view, right? That's who really funded the revolution here.
And I think that's 100% correct.
And so the way I'm seeing this play out, like in my experience, is that you have a lot of startup brands that are trying to get to that next level. And, we've seen instances where there might be a conservative voice in this case that has been responsible for double-digit contribution to the sales of the organization. Now that's double-digit contribution to the employees of the organization. That's double-digit contribution to the values of the organization.
Sure.
And so when there is an organized effort who says, soundbite happened, pull your ads, or else we're going to call you out publicly, startup brand X, because you're in association with this person, they have to go, well, is that how I want to be making decisions? Is that is that actually advancing the values that I believe in? And is it?
Well, yeah. So I hear what you're saying. But the thing is that if your values is, I do not want to support somebody who puts out speech that could be harmful for the people that buy my product, right? Why am I paying this person money? And so even though that person might be able to quintuple my sales, it is a choice to compromise on a certain morality for financial gain. What are we talking about here, right? And so like this is the kind of these are the choices that we have to be honest when we're making, and if you're going to make that compromise, just know, like, keep it to your little heart. Just know that you've compromised a little bit on your views, and that's, I'm not gonna. It's one of those things where you can't get away from this clean if you think that you're separate from the politics, because everything is political. Every dollar is political. That has to be understood.
Yeah, I guess where you and I may part on this subject in terms of alignment is that my perception is that we live in a very we live in a gray area, and the world wants it to be black and white. They want the villains to wear the black hats and the good guys to wear the white hats, and they want it to be very clean. And I think that if you're a true believer on either side of the equation, you're probably wrong, and you're probably not listening enough to the other side. And so I think that we end up painting both sides paint each other with too broad a brush. And I find myself frequently in arguments with people that are too far on one side or the other, in my view, because they want to defend, and they want to label, and they want to put everything in clean little boxes. And my belief is that there is actually something right happening on both sides. And the more that we can engage in communication about those things, the more that we can actually establish relationship, the more progress can be made on real issues. I think that we've seen two major world events happen this year now, and somehow it became Democrats versus Republicans when it doesn't have to be a Republican versus Democrat issue. Everybody that I know is appalled, as we all should be, by what we saw with George Floyd. And yet the conversation descends into riots and looters versus, you're a racist if you're talking about the riots and looters. And it's like, why are we talking about that at all? And why are we not aligning on the fact that there's something wrong here and we have to fix it? And if all we do is go to our political ideology bunkers and throw grenades at each other, we're not actually making progress. And so something that I'm trying to do, and listen, let me also disclose, I'm financially incentivized to have this position, I want to disclose that, but I also want to say, I still think what I think, and I still believe this to be true, that you will make more progress for good if you can collaborate with people who don't see the world the way that you do, because at some point our whole system is set up that different parties have to agree. And so when I see this happening, what comes across my desk is somebody makes a statement, their job is to talk, right? Their job is to give opinions for hours or entertain for hours. And they say something that they shouldn't have said the way that they said it. but then that becomes a scarlet letter for them. And they get put in a box, and instead of engaging with them and saying, you know, what if advertisers actually picked up the phone and got on the phone with the hosts themselves and said, we have a problem with the way that you did this. We'd like you to either make amends, or we would like to see you change in the way that you address this topic, or we want you to hear different voices. You could have a real impact. But what I see happening is the divisions just keep getting deeper and deeper and deeper. And suddenly it's not safe to be anywhere. And so we don't hear each other. And so I apologize.
No.
That's where I'm coming from on this.
This is your platform. You should feel free to speak however you like.
Well, but you're my guest, and you have great thoughts on this stuff. So please respond.
To bracket out, I mean, again, so I think naturally, just to get a hot meta second here, the nature of a sort of a dual party conversation like this it naturally makes it feel like I'm in opposition to you. Yeah. We share a couple of things. One, I do share this concern that in the wake of any politically explosive moment, there has to be some push towards a reconstruction.
Yes.
Sorry, struck that word. It has historical connotations. In the wake of every explosive political moment like this, there has to be some effort to mend the bridges, to sort of bring everybody together. If not, we're in an intractable situation, and it brings to sort of an everlasting conflict. But I think I feel like I differ in a sense that I kind of think that all forms of combat for all forms of political and verbal combat and ideological combat is somewhat valid here, because the rules of engagement didn't apply to everybody before this moment, right? Yes, we are bothered. Of course, we are bothered by the death of George Floyd, but hundreds of and thousands of Black people have been killed by police officers and have been sort of disenfranchised from the economic system for generations. And this is a means to mend that tumor in a societal body. So I kind of look at this situation, and yes, there will be collateral difficulties with something like a brand trying to buy on a show, buy ad slots on a show that maybe engages in a poor form of political discourse on that, or what is perceived to be a poor form. But for me personally, I think if you just kind of take a couple of steps back away from the individual and understand ourselves to be part of a complex society and system, that is something that happens, and that's something that will happen. And the responsibility of any individual actor is to live with those consequences. There will always be cost to action. There will always be cost to action. That is the definition of being alive and being an adult. And so I kind of feel like I get what you're coming from. I get the frustrations of the brands you might be working with. But this is what we mean when we say to be more thoughtful with the way we approach our lives, to be more comprehensive, to think about the way that we're responsible to each other. Our every action is embedded in a system. And, you can't become a millionaire or a billionaire in America, in the world, without knowing that it comes at a cost for certain kinds of people. And this is I think a sort of counter response to that. That is an expression of that reality. First of all, just to say as an aside, I don't think I've ever talked politics substantially in a public forum before.
You're doing great. And by the way, I don't really do this either in a business forum. So,
and I should also say I am not American. I'm from Malaysia, born and raised in Malaysia, and I'm not even a citizen. But this is how much I kind of believe in the possibility of this country. And why I'm still fucking here, despite the fact that y'all basically gave up on the goddamn pandemic. I'm still fucking here. Also because my wife is here, so whatever.
Well, I'm glad that you're here, and I'm not making that statement to wrap this up because I'm really enjoying this conversation. I don't want to get lost on something you just said because I want to affirm something that you said, which is you identify that we have a tumor, right? We fucked up so bad in this country, and then we perpetuated it. And I think a lot of people were thinking, well, we've resolved that now. And now what I think has been exposed to many is that, no, this is not resolved. There is so much more work that needs to be done. And I don't, if I'm understanding you correctly, I think I am in agreement with that. I also acknowledge what you're saying, which is anytime you want to make change, there's going to be collateral damage. And, whether a brand sponsors a show may not be the penultimate, issue in society today. But here's the macro point to me, is that there's an opportunity for people to unite on this issue. There's an opportunity to make positive change on this issue. And when you exacerbate the collateral damage by somebody says, hey, I see this as a problem and I want to help, and then you stone them because something that they said 4 years ago was insensitive, they might have been wrong to say that, but wouldn't you do better by the cause by widening the tent, by folding them in and trying to actually unite from a diverse set of voices, even if they're representing something that's been exposed as as failing on this in the past? There's an opportunity for redemption here, or some degree of redemption. And so, it may be as simple as just saying you get more flies with honey than vinegar, but like, we've got real problems to solve. And I think that the way that this descends into this partisan, it's schoolyard politics. And I just feel like the labels don't help, the separations don't help. There should be an effort to at least try to find a place to align and pull people with you toward the things that we all can agree now need to change, rather than just putting them on the defense, so that the subject gets changed from the issue that you were originally focused on to they're bad and they're trying to say, no, you're bad, we're not bad. And that's a distraction. That's a misuse of energy that becomes less constructive. And so that's kind of the crux of my argument here. It's not to say that, it doesn't matter what you say in free speech, you should get to say whatever you want, but it's like, we have a moment where we can unite. We saw these signs go up in the lobby of the building that our office is in. It says, we're all in this together, right? People were saying that over and over again. We are not all in this together, but we could have been, and we still to some extent could be, and we could actually affect change in a more meaningful way if we stopped, getting into, spending our energy calling each other out, and instead try to pull together to work toward things that need to be addressed. That's my contention.
No, I hear what you're saying. And I think what we're seeing and what's happening is, so one thing that nobody wants in this situation, when I say nobody, I think is one thing that I don't think that the people making the push for change right now wants to see is a return to the status quo, a return to what it was 4 months ago, even, right? People want to see actual tangible change of what that means. And so any unification effort has to start from there. And any unification effort also needs a figure, a centralizing force that's able to consolidate the narrative. And this is what we're seeing as a political opportunity right now. This is, in theory, what, again, to get like, to really just like dive headfirst into American politics, but like, that is in theory what Joe Biden's supposed to be, right? That he's supposed to be this figure, or at least somebody on the
How's
left.
he doing?
I have no fucking idea. Is to channel, to consolidate, to symbolize, and then to carry out how this change is specifically going to happen. And I think there's just so much mistrust, because every time this has happened in the past, there have been, blue ribbon, whatever reports, and there have been sort of gestures of policy reform. But the fact of the matter is that people still keep dying. Black people still keep being killed by the cops. That Black Americans are still facing a downward trajectory into the wealth creation for generations. And so it's a situation where, like, yes, we all want to hold hands in kumbaya, but nobody wants everybody to unify without any proper things in place to symbolize how any of this is going to get better. So, I hear you, but I don't think we can begin to come to peace to this without there actually being active peacemaking efforts. But also, we're only in week 3, I want to say, of this sort of movement, this moment. And this is the process. This is, I don't know if you watch basketball, but you got to just trust the process. Like, this is where it happens. You have this extreme force that's trying to force extreme policy positions, and it shocks the system into figuring out how to tailor the practical reach towards whatever those gains are going to be. So, you know,
Well, and by the way, I agree with that, and that's why I don't spend a lot of time talking about riots and looting, because all that does is make the problem worse. That's an indicator that we need to be listening more closely. And so I 100% agree on that. I just don't want to see the discussion devolve into things that are actually off topic, which is what I see happening, right? And so when somebody, in my personal life starts changing the subject from George Floyd and policy to riots, it's my goal is to steer the conversation back to the issue, because
no,
that's
well,
not the
actually,
cause, right?
your goal, which is maybe similar to my goal, should be to connect the two things. Why are we seeing riots and lootings? How is that related to policy and
Right.
death?
Well, and when I say the subject, I agree with that, but what I mean, just to clarify, is that to get to the source, to get to the root.
Yeah.
Right. And not argue about the peripherals, because they're not they're not the issue. They're a byproduct of the issue. And I think that we can do so much better. And maybe I'm being, Pollyanna here, but I feel like distraction and misuse of energy in the name of doing good can actually undermine the causes that we are actually able to affect here. And so I want to stay focused on the root, and try not to, throw rocks at the volunteers, that are actually, you've seen people in the last few weeks that you might not have thought were going to come out on what I may see as the right side of this issue, do that. And so you've got a chance here to win people over to important issues, and you finally have a moment. But if you shame them, you may not see the same impact for what really matters. And we just
I think I see where we fundamentally disagree, which is
Okay.
I have come to theoretically understand shame as a valid political tool. And I think there are people who disagree with that view.
Yeah, you might have found it, because I don't like it.
Yeah, no, and you are free to your
Yeah.
political disposition. But I think shame has traditionally also been a very important societal shaping tool. As a person who comes from a culture of intense, like where shame is like a big thing in our households. But yeah, no, I feel that it's a politically valid tool, and that's kind of where my theory lies on, like kind of falls on that.
Yeah, I feel like I've seen more change in my life and the lives of people around me when people are approached from a place of love and acceptance first, and then the change can occur. And you might be able to do behavior modification through shame and punishment, but I don't think that it's constructive to amplify that. So we may have identified a difference here, and that's cool. We can agree to disagree on stuff.
What a journey! What a journey!
What a
this
journey!
podcast, this
Yeah. So how about that? So what about Joe Rogan?
Yeah, really rich guy, pretty bald.
Okay. So listen, if you don't mind, we can go into more industry specific topics, but
do what you want, man. It's your show.
Yeah, thank you. Well, if you're still good, I'm gonna ask the audience for a little bit of help here with something that's very important to me. And when we come back, we're all gonna take a deep breath, and we're going to just talk a little bit lighter about some things that are important to the industry. But what I want to talk about is, the first crisis that we had this year with COVID-19. One of the ugliest manifestations of it was the fact that it separated the people who were sick from the families and loved ones who might be able to support them bedside. And, when somebody is hurting or suffering and they can't have that support and comfort, it is truly tragic. And this may have been a nuanced event that was happening because of this health crisis, but it is not an isolated event. It is something that happens every day at children's hospitals across America, where you have young children with life-threatening illnesses alone in a bed with nobody to comfort them. even though they might have world-class medical care and devoted parents, but they may be working parents, or they may have other children they're trying to deal with. They just can't be bedside all the time. And we experienced this firsthand in my home when our youngest daughter was born with a myriad of life-threatening medical issues. We were by her side at Children's Hospital for about 6 months and gave her all the comfort that we could. But, you know, we couldn't be there 100% of the time. And we saw so many kids who had no one around them. And so we vowed to do something about it. And so led by my wife, Sierra, we started something called the Koala Corps, which is a fundraising arm for Children's Hospital to hire staff to run the program, because there are lots of volunteers who want to help. There are lots of kids in need. There's nobody to vet, train, manage the volunteers, to recruit them. And so the problem just keeps getting worse. You can help solve this problem by supporting the Koala Corps, which doesn't touch a cent. All the money goes directly to Children's Hospital for this fund. But we have a platform at koalacorps.com. That's KOALACORPS.com. And give what you can, because this is a persistent issue that needs help. So we're back with Nick. If you found this show helpful so far, please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Also visit oxfordroad.com, subscribe to our newsletter, The Influencer, for industry updates and thought leadership. Okay, Nick, this has been pretty heavy. Let's lighten it up a little bit. And we're going to do a rapid fire Q&A about your daily routines to do all that you do. So you ready?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, let's go. Number one, what time do you get up in the morning?
6:30.
Do you have a nighttime or morning ritual?
No.
Okay. How much
I get up,
time
I go straight to work.
you get up and you start working? How much time do you spend in meetings versus actually doing work?
These days, virtually no meetings.
Okay. Do you schedule breaks?
No.
Okay. What do you do to keep yourself sane with not only the volume of work to be done, but just all of the heaviness going on in the world around us? What do you do to keep peace of mind?
With the caveat that I do not have peace of mind, and I'm very sort of anxious all the time. I run. I watch a lot of movies. I read a lot. Essentially, and then I hang out with my wife. That's what I do.
That's good. Okay. And what are you streaming right now?
I'm about, after this conversation, gonna check out the new Spike Lee film.
Very good. And where do you take your news?
Anywhere I can get it.
Okay. And when you listen to audio, what speed do you listen to it at?
1.2.
1.2?
Mm-hmm.
I'm shocked. I thought I would have pegged you as a 2.5 to a 3 with how fast your brain moves.
As it turns out, that's not how my brain can work. I tried doing 1.5 for a couple of months, but I was just retaining much less.
By the way, I try to listen to these episodes so that I can, improve the process, and I cannot do it at one speed. I will lose my mind. And so I tell everybody, please listen at 2x. Please listen at 2x. Okay. Is there one new habit you've introduced since everybody started working from home?
Say that again?
Is there one new habit that you've introduced into your day since work from home went into effect?
I never thought I was going to be a yoga person, but I'm a yoga person now.
You did it.
I did it.
Congratulations. Okay.
Thank you.
All right, let's get back to the conversation and talk a little bit more about the industry. Can you just give us a little bit of backstory on you? Normally we do this at the top of the interview, but we just went right into the elephant in the room, right? How did you get into this?
By accident, by mistake. I was working another job in late 2014, and I had been listening to podcasts, been a podcast fan for a long time by that time. And Serial happened, the first season. It exploded. Everybody started writing about Serial, started going about what is this podcast thing, and I felt very unsatisfied with what I was reading, and so I started a newsletter for fun. And 6 years later, it's my full-time job, so can't complain.
Okay, and what are some of the top trends that you're seeing in the industry right now?
In addition to, so I just wrote about this past week, and I continue to be fascinated by it. Is so one thing we saw is the number of podcasts explicitly about race have bubbled up to the top. This kind of mirrors a lot what we're seeing in other mediums. Like I think the best-selling list in books on the nonfiction side has been dominated by anti-racist literature right now, which is great.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that's also interesting is the COVID-19 podcasts have almost completely fallen off the charts. And I'm just sort of fascinated by that and what that says about sort of this moment. But for more structural trend perspective, I have heard my sense is that there's a continual push towards de-risking now. With every new project, there's just a little less appetite for risk than there used to be. And I'm a little bit annoyed by that, but I'm curious to see where this goes. I understand the logic of it. When you launch something, you want to make sure you hit the numbers. But the question for me now comes to, where are we going to see the interesting pockets of creative innovation here? I kind of feel like there will always be a pathway for smaller shows to do that. But the big trend is, what the coronavirus pandemic has done to listening and ad spend. I think you probably have a better vantage point into ad spends from this perspective. I've heard that it's coming back up. It is by no means back on track, but it is at least a little better than it used to be a couple of weeks ago. And listening essentially is now back in the right direction. So that's been comforting to see. But what will be interesting to figure out is how the widespread behavioral changes of how we live our lives now are going to impact where we slide podcast listening into our time. The finding in the recent Stitcher podcast report that people have made it up through made the daily commute listening up in lunchtime listening is super interesting. It makes me think there should be more food podcasts out there.
You just said like 8 different podcast episodes that I want to discuss with you. Like, I'm going to pick one and I want you to unpack it. Do you think that the golden age of podcasting is coming to an end, at least in terms of advancement and innovation?
That question presupposes that there was substantial innovation to begin with, which one would argue, yes, maybe there was. I kind of reject many perceptions of golden ages of anything, largely because I really do think that the best days are ahead of us. But we're past the era. We were past the age of something. Before Spotify bought Gimlet and Anchor, I think that action marked the end of that era, which I would argue started with Serial.
Total agreement with that, by the way. And as somebody who is in the AM radio business, I think it really was, whether or not you want to call it a golden age, I think there was a renaissance of audio content that was being created and experimentation. And, Serial was just such a new way to use the vehicle. But it's almost like we've hit a cliff or a diminishing return on how far you can push it. And so we've talked about the kind of gentrification of the space a little bit. It does appear that we may have reached that. Now it's more about, optimization and efficiencies by corporations, rather than, just kind of it's like the art, when the art museum goes up in the city, there's a renaissance. And then when the Starbucks comes in, that's the beginning of the end. Right. And that doesn't mean the podcast is going to go away, but I do think in terms of the rate of evolution, it does appear to me that's changing.
Yeah, and so again, I don't want to put us in a historical situation where we look back at that time as kinder than it was. Like there were a lot of things that didn't work about that era, and there was a lot of innovation that I think we oversell in that era. But for me, the question is like, where will the innovation come from right now? Is it naturally or necessarily the situation there when there's a lot of money, we stop seeing certain creative risks? And I think the mere existence of where we are with film is I think a counterpoint to that there is still structures that you can build, for to make A24 style like podcasts, right? Like there's a ton of really good movies still being made, innovative, interesting, challenging movies still being made. And I think there's a pathway for that to still be the case in podcasting. Again, not to oversell how innovative and risk-taking the previous era was.
Yeah.
And part of
Oh,
it,
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, but possibly relative to what had been available to everyone before.
Yeah, for sure.
It's
Part
like
of it,
we went from 3 networks to having Netflix today, in terms of our access to content. And I do think that was a major shift for, what we could fill our ears with.
yeah, and it also, like, to stick with Netflix, like it gave more exposure to, I would argue, documentary as a form, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think documentaries are super hot with the cinema system.
Mm-hmm.
One
Agreed.
part of this conversation I think that should be relevant is, will we see any risk taking whatsoever from bigger companies? Will we see any spends on newer voices? Like, will they be able to shape up the accounting such that we have our money makers, but also let's put some budget aside for the crazier shit? And that would be
Mm-hmm.
something that we'd love to see.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I'm interested in your take on is the smart speaker space. Are you paying attention to flash briefings and new ways that people are using audio through that platform?
I am definitely theoretically interested in it, because obviously it's quite important, particularly with the fast adoption of smart speakers into everybody's day-to-day life. For me, the framework that I've started thinking, or I've long thought about smart speakers, is who has the power.
Mm.
And like,
I think we know the answer to
yeah,
that.
I mean, Amazon has the power, right? Like, so, like, yeah, it's interesting to hear the latest innovations in news briefing from a variety of media companies. But up until we answer how monetization is truly going to work, I do not trust I do not trust the environment necessarily.
I see. Well, let me throw a couple theories at you and see what you think. The first innovation that I see happening there is, podcast is interesting because it's long form, and you and I can have this type of discussion. You can't do that. You can't do that in a short form space, but it's providing a platform for content to figure out, how do I give you like the Twitter version of podcasting? How do I give you a summary or a pared down version so that you can have a wider range of what you consume from multiple voices in less time, right? And so I do think there's something about it. I think it's more conducive to shorter length content, and I do think that there can be some real innovation in that as wave one. Wave two after that, what I predict is that as the technology gets better, having the ability to make content interactive and dynamic, so you can really choose your own adventure and go down different paths through voice command and have it respond to you. Having the speaker be responsive is a very, very exciting opportunity, I think. So those are my predictions. If we're talking 5-10 years out, do you have any thoughts on either of those?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. Like, I think we already have the creative imagination to know what the infinite plan looks like, and it's basically the movie Her.
Mm.
Like, can we construct a system in which, like, the AI is responsive and interesting enough to, on the one hand, beat the Turing test, but also serve a certain kind of need that goes beyond what it's serving right now? Because right now my relationship with my smart speakers, it's incredibly transactional, right? Like, what is the weather? Play the thing. You're our radio, or you're also a dispensary of podcasts I might want to hit to. What else can I use you for? And maybe it will look like a situation where you can have really branching conversations. But again, you're gonna have to beat the Turing test, because the uncanny valley. My experience with the smart speaker, I never trust my smart speaker, partly because of the larger narratives about surveillance and
because it's listening to you.
Yeah, basically.
Yeah,
And also, like, I have given up my own principles a ton of time. Like, I'm still an Amazon user, while I know that, like, the things that they're doing to me. And you listen, we all
We
are
all
sinners.
make compromises, don't we?
We're all sinners to varying extents. And so, like, what is the thing? What is the thing that gets me to give up my principles around surveillance? I don't know, but it's not there.
I totally think that's it. It's like, at some point, everybody, like, we all gave up on our phones, right? Like, we turned it over and said, yeah, I know I shouldn't, but it's just too good. I'm going to do it. Right.
Right.
And I
I
think
still
that,
drive a car, knowing very full well that I'm putting money into pockets of people I don't want to be putting money into.
yeah, so you've got like a third of America that's got these things in their houses and they already made the trade. And the rest of us are kind of going, yeah, but it's not that much better than my clock radio. So like, when's it going to be, so cool that I can't not do it. Right. And
Yeah.
I think it's kind of waiting for its like serial moment, right? Where there's something that is so good that it starts everybody starts paying attention to it.
Yeah,
But
it's the killer app theory, right? Like you can't sell a video game console without the end all product within it. And so I feel like the Echo's, I think the whole buying and selling to the e-commerce aspect of it is probably what we're going to get closer to. I kind of feel like that's where it's going to be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's probably old news by now, but I do think the Rogan move was important. How would you summarize what that means to the industry?
I was very proud of a line that I used in the newsletter
Do
about that.
share.
Oh wait, yeah. Okay, so I feel like the way to define it is every other move up until this point has been win later moves. Like these are investments for achievements further down the line.
Mm-hmm.
Rogan's the win now, right? Again, you don't watch sports, but for me to go on a
I've heard
gratuitous,
about these sports that you speak
yeah,
of.
well, to use a gratuitous metaphor here, is like you build a team initially out of high prospect players that would be really great 2-3 years down the line. You just brought in a star player that's going to pull everybody together and increase everybody's game. I think that's what we're seeing with Rogan and Spotify.
Now, Edison is looking like they're going for the kind of new Nielsen. Do you buy it in terms of like, does anybody have a rating system that we can trust?
No, but then again, can we actually trust the Nielsen system?
No. You do it
Yeah.
at anything that is attribution or ratings is people are going to hate it from the minute you publish it, and they're going to question it the whole time of your existence. That's my theory.
Yeah,
But
so
one of
I
them's
mean,
got to dominate, right?
I just have two thoughts on this. One is, as with all things, all these individual data slices only shows you one part of the elephant. If you really want a full picture, you should look at all different parts and try to build a consolidated picture. However, the second thing is that most people do not want to do that work. And I don't know how this Edison ranker is going to work out, but honestly, whoever wins, like at least we'll have an easy way to construct the narrative moving forward, easier way to construct the narrative moving forward, whether or not it's 100% accurate. I have historically given a ton of shit to the Podcheck ranker about stuff like this,
Sure.
but I also understand its utility in building the narrative around podcasting.
You do the best you can with what you have.
Yep.
Did you pull anything out of the podcast one move? Does that mean anything to the business?
To put it diplomatically, I think it means quite little. I don't think it fundamentally changes any equation for both that company or the industry.
Would you agree with the idea that it was a bit of a level setting of expectations of people that might have felt like, I'm going to go into podcast and be a millionaire, or I'm going to sell, if I have a podcast company, it sells for hundreds of millions of dollars. Do you think maybe it was bringing some of those expectations down to earth a little bit? And does it mean anything about valuations going forward?
I don't think I don't think ultimately. I think all that work of people not finally realizing that it's not sort of an easy high-end turnaround, acquisition environments. I think that has already been happening prior to the podcast one moment.
Okay.
But I do.
What was the first signal you saw that indicated that? If you can think of it.
The fact that there hasn't been a ton of buyers outside of Spotify. Like one of the questions I keep trying to answer for myself when people ask me about what do you think the next acquisition is going to happen is like, who are the buyers? I have no clue, but we will see more acquisitions moving forward. It's just that the kinds of companies being bought, those are unreplicatable to some extent. And I think that's interesting.
When do you think we hit $1 billion?
Well, we were supposed to hit it 2021, right? Like that was what everybody was saying.
Yeah. And do you care?
Personally, I don't care. But I bet people listening to this podcast care.
Yeah.
My theory is that the pandemic has slowed that and will be slowing that timeline to some extent. But the other theory that I have is that we need to see what happens when Spotify finally flips on the switch for their ad tech. And the subsequent questions from that is that, do you count that as podcast advertising? That's a whole other thing.
When they flip that switch, what does that mean as a user?
What it means as a user is that you will hear, more podcasts on that platform, third party and owned, will have ads, in some form or another. Spotify will be facilitating those ads and that revenue.
So it's like YouTube AdSense kind of thing.
The worst possible version would look like that. The best possible outcome is they figure out how to do this in a way that retains the current existing value of why people like podcast ads, because of the I hate to use the word, but because of the intimacy, because of the thoughtfulness, because of the relationship between a host and a listener, if it's in that format. The question is how do you do that? And that's not my answer to solve. That's Spotify's, or whatever programmatic platform there is. That's Megaphone, Art19, all that kind of stuff.
Earlier, we both agreed that is really performance oriented D2C brands that built the place from a revenue perspective. Are you paying attention to the shift toward brand marketers coming into the space?
Yes and no. I know that for the majority of podcast ad sellers and bigger podcast companies, that the big push is to bring more brand dollars into the space, largely because it's just a bigger pot of money and they can spend more reliably over time if they stick around and if they love you. But you also need to balance that out with a more stable form of advertisers, because DR advertisers are here for a reason, because they see that it works. Brand advertising, it's harder to prove the work sometimes, the conversions, and so it's a little bit more fleeting. And so I don't know, any moderately intelligent ad agency or podcast company would want to diversify the mix, but not lean too much one way or the other. So to that extent, I'm watching that part of the equation closely.
And do you think more brand marketers are going to help or hurt the content?
It's a good question. It's a very good question. I think it will probably help and hurt. It will help in a sense that it will let the people making the content feel a little bit more confident in their future earnings and budgets. On the other hand, it incentivizes it might incentivize different choices being made around content. Maybe people want to be managing risks a little more than taking risks. It also will attract more people into the space that otherwise wouldn't participate, which is either a good thing or bad thing, depending on where you are, on how you think about all these things.
Yeah. I think, to your concern earlier about de-risking, I think that the bigger the brand, the less risk in the content. And so that may not get the desired effect in many cases as more control comes into it. And
I love Marvel movies, but man, those don't last very long.
Okay. Can you do you mind just doing a quick summary of Servant of Pod?
I should.
I'm not going to add a the to it. I'm not going to speak this time.
Yeah.
Tell us what you got going.
So essentially, it's going to be a weekly show. My goal with it is just to build out a catalog of conversations with people about podcast business. The way I think about it is that it is a tour guide for people who are otherwise not super familiar with podcasting as a universe into different pockets of it. It's a mix between a travel show and a community radio show in my head, but in practice, it's long conversations with people who make stuff in the space at all levels. And I'm excited.
As somebody who's been, taking stabs at this industry, like trying to engage with it since like 2006, we launched in 2013. But I sort of felt like, the cobbler's son who has no shoes, not having a podcast, but also being like, there's a million of them. Why would, right? Like, did you have to struggle through some of that personally to be like, the irony of it?
Absolutely. One of the things that I consistently struggle with is why should I be the one that has a platform?
Right.
And that's just like a confidence thing. But the way that I'm also seeing this is that it's a creative exercise for me. Like I'm a journalist second, I'm a creative person first. Like I have long observed this space. I have theories about it. I want to grow my empathy for the people that I'm writing about and the space I'm writing about. And so, while there is a ton of arguments as to why people covering something should not be participating in that thing, I kind of feel this is a worthwhile exercise to get into and a worthwhile project to build up, because I don't know, you just want to try this out sometimes, and this is kind of what this is for now. There's also a secondary theory here, which is I do think that the podcast industry has swung westward in the United States. Like it's getting increasingly LA centric. And
I feel like it started that way and then it all ran over to the East Coast real quick.
And now it's back. So
now it's back. Okay.
and so that would be one of the sort of hypotheses that I'll be exploring in the show. Yeah.
Well, and listen, I think anything that creates empathy and hearing other voices is a noble cause, and certainly you've proven here today that you're not just an excellent writer. You certainly are made for this medium, and I appreciate it. I feel like I've gotten a full body workout here. I feel like I've been at the gym for 2 hours. But it's good exercise, and I really think people will benefit from hearing your perspectives on this. So I just want to thank you for who you are, for what you do, and for all the vulnerability and candor that you've brought to this conversation. So thank you. So for show notes on this interview, curated media news, and more, please visit oxfordroad.com and subscribe to our newsletter, The Influencer, for industry updates and thought leadership. Special thanks to Bianca, Kyle, Jennifer, for helping make this happen. And please remember to subscribe on iTunes, Google Podcasts, or even Spotify, wherever you get your shows. If you liked it, leave us a review. And if you don't have something nice to say, please send us an email, podcast@oxfordroad.com. We want to hear your feedback and keep making this thing better. So thank you for sharing this part of your day with us. And above all else, never, never, never give up.